Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is commemorating Native American Heritage Month in November, and I'm pleased to have Shasta Gaughen, who is the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers representative on the ACHP, join me today. Shasta is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of the Mission Indians in California. Shasta is a cultural anthropologist who received her PhD from the University of New Mexico. Welcome, Shasta.
Thanks, Luke.
Before we talk about THPOs, there's so many acronyms in this world. Before we talk about THPOs, I've got a personal interest in your past work. When I was appointed, I tried to feel out all those who kind of had an academic background and learn about their specialty. And so I've got to ask about your dissertation. Those of us who've written dissertations, we never read it again. We hope that maybe our parents might read it one day. But your dissertation was about gaming and Indian tribes. And so when I read it, I remember my reactions. First of all, it was interesting, a lot more interesting than my dissertation on US-European relations during the Nixon administration. But I was personally interested and have been a long time, ever since I first visited a casino. We've got other things to talk about here, but could you briefly say, how did you get into this topic? What were kind of your central conclusions? And does this have any relevance to your work today?
So those are really terrific questions, and I'm thrilled that somebody is interested in what I wrote. And I wrote this dissertation because I was interested in what the impacts of gaming were on tribal communities. And so specifically, I worked in Paula first as a volunteer, as a graduate student at San Diego State. And then when I moved over to University of New Mexico for my PhD, I continued to work in Paula and asked the tribal leadership if it would be okay if I did do a little bit of a comparison between life before and life after the casino, the Paula casino. And my hypothesis going in was that the casino was going to have a significant impact on the tribe, but that was really going to depend on what I actually looked at. So I decided to focus on politics, economics, and identity. And the reason for that is because a lot of folks at the time that casinos were starting to become more and more common on Indian lands was that there was this assumption that a successful casino meant that tribal culture was necessarily going to be diminished in some way. And I thought, I don't think that that's necessarily true. So when I looked at Paula and saw that their casino, which opened in 2001, and I started doing research here in 1999, so I had a little bit of an eye on what things were like beforehand. Once the casino opened and it was quite successful very quickly, what I determined was that the influx of money allowed the folks at Paula to be able to stop worrying about everyday concerns on a financial level. So there was less of a concern about being able to put food on the table, being able to put shoes on your kids. And when you don't have those same economic stressors, you're able to turn your attention to things like cultural revitalization and preservation. So there was an increase in tribal work on language, for example, bringing back the Cupeño language and starting language classes, and bird singing, which is an important tribal tradition. And so really the conclusion was that rather than eroding tribal culture, casinos and successful gaming enterprises actually enhance the ability for tribes to preserve those practices.
It's so interesting, and we'll move on to our kind of the meat here of the podcast. But I would just say, I came away thinking this is a work that really deserves a wider audience, and so I would encourage viewers, listeners to Google it and take a look. It's just I find it just be so interesting. So thank you for summing that up so well. Now let's move on to, I guess we have day jobs, sort of your role. I'm still someone who says, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And so I imagine you feel the same way some days. But let's move on now to sort of what is a tribal historic preservation officer and what do they do?
Well, I will try not to spend 3 hours explaining this because it is a somewhat a complicated thing, but to keep it simple, There's something called a state historic preservation officer, and all 50 states have what are by short are called SHPOs. And so tribes also have the ability to take the responsibilities that SHPOs have for states, but they undertake them for the trust lands that are dedicated to the tribes. So what a THPO does, and we call them THPOs because we wanted to rhyme with SHPO, a THPO is responsible for historic preservation issues within tribal trust lands. And any given tribe, any federally recognized tribe can apply to the National Park Service to take over the SHPO's responsibilities for the trust lands, the tribal trust lands within a particular state. So Paula did that in 2008, and we were one of, I think at the time we were like number 95 in the THPO program, and now there are over 200 THPOs. So the program continues to grow.
Wow. I think that would be a surprise, to some who don't know that there's such a vast, organization with varying concerns. One of our things we talk about all the time during meetings at the agency is really desire to bring more young people in, to the preservation fields. So, I mean, imagine that person watching, listening right now, who's interested in you, your background, what you do, and how do I get more involved? How do I have a career in this? What is it like working for an Indian tribe? Do you have a typical day? So the point that so we grow up, learning a thumbnail sketch of Native American history. People might have had some more personal encounters during travel someplace. But my point is, for those who don't live kind of near, Indian tribes, tell us a little more. Kind of, you've been kind of on the outside, more on the inside now. Kind of, what's this like?
Well, I want to make clear to the listeners that I myself am not Indigenous. My ancestry is European, and so I'm in an interesting position in that I'm responsible for Paula's tribal historic preservation. And my background as an anthropologist is partly what brought me to this place. I was the one who actually did the application and started the process and saw Paula through to having a tribal historic preservation office. So to date, I'm the only THPO that Paula has ever had. And my goal ultimately is for a Paula tribal member to be in this position, because I don't think that it really should be a white anthropologist who is doing this work on behalf of the tribe. At the same time, what I would tell somebody who is interested in this kind of work is that tribes need allies. And so that means that you don't have to be Indigenous yourself. You don't need to be a tribal member. And I know that this is something that a lot of people are doing now, land acknowledgement and understanding that everywhere you go, you are on Indigenous land, you are on tribal land. So even if you're not familiar with any particular tribe that may or be close to where you are, because federally recognized tribes are scattered all over the country, but there are some states that actually do not have any federally recognized tribes within their borders. That doesn't mean that there isn't tribal land there, because it's all tribal land. So I would encourage people to learn about the history of where they live, what tribes used to live on these lands, and where are those tribes today. And if you want to work with them, if you want to be a good ally, if you yourself are not Indigenous, learn those things. And then what I did that was very successful is I reached out as a volunteer. I came to Paula's Kupa Cultural Center and I started working with folks there just as a graduate student. I came during the summers and I did whatever work needed to be done. And so if you have that kind of interest in working with a tribe, then reach out to one that may be close to where you are and just ask what you can do. And don't be dissuaded if it turns out that they say, well, we're not sure if we have anything for you. Tribes are often a little nervous or a little wary of people who just show up and say, hey, I want to help you. But learn as much as you can. And that's the best way to try to find your way into this kind of work, and be ready to pass it on to somebody who is a member of that community if that's what the tribe decides they want to do.
Well, that sounds like completely sound advice to me from someone who's done it and been there. Now, we've talked, you wear so many hats. We've talked about kind of your academic hat. We've talked about your THPO hat. Let's talk about your NAFPO hat, so the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. So how do you as an organization help these 200 plus THPOs?
Well, it's a lot of work. I will say that NAFPO is a great organization, and it's analogous to the NICHPO, which is the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. I will say NICHPO is much better funded because the money that goes to SHPOs, necessarily a small percentage of that goes to fund NICHPO. And NAFPO is much the same way, but tribes who have THPOs aren't necessarily required to be NAFPO members. Nevertheless, what NAFPO does is it advocates for the needs of THPOs, and that means going to Capitol Hill and advocating for more funding through the Historic Preservation Fund for THPOs. We get our funding from money that goes to the Park Service, and the Park Service administers the THPO program. The issue that's unfortunate for us is that the amount of money, it's increased some, but it hasn't kept up with the number of THPOs that have been declared. And when you consider that there are now 572, I think, federally recognized tribes, that's potentially 572 THPOs. And so, and again, we have over 200 now, and there are new applications going in all the time, so that money gets split up. So with NAFPO, we take the small membership fee that our members pay, and then we also look for grant and other funding opportunities to be able to continue the work in Washington, D.C. with bills and with funding and with statutes and regulations, and of course, with my role as the representative on the advisory council. And our executive director, Valerie Gressing, is the one who is actually in Washington, D.C., who's doing all that work on the ground, because I'm 3,000 miles away and it's a little more difficult for me to do it. So we are grateful that we have the membership that we do, but we don't limit our advocacy just to our THPO members. We're trying to expand funding and resources and programming for all tribal historic preservation programs, whether they are NPS THPOs or not.
Okay, so you clarify, what is NAFPO doing to work with THPOs? How does the ACHP then work with THPOs?
Well, the ACHP has a lot of work to do in terms of the Section 106 process, which under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 is the part of the statute that requires consultation on projects that might have an effect on historic resources. So what the ACHP does for tribes is, if there is some sort of, let's just say, a conflict, I could use more colorful language, between a tribe or tribes who are consulting on a project with a federal agency, and if the tribe feels that the consultation process is not going well, or that there's been an unresolvable conflict, then we can go to the ACHP, and the ACHP will help to mediate that conflict between the agency and the tribe to help come up with an appropriate solution, so that whatever tribal interests are in the preservation or protection of a site is considered as part of the mitigation measures or the protection measures that are integrated into the agency action, whether it's a permit, whether it's the agency itself that's engaging in a project. The ACHP has the, I will say, unenviable position of having to negotiate and arbitrate between the tribe and the agency to come up with a solution.
I think that answer was spoken more like a diplomat, which is another one of your hats, than perhaps a cultural anthropologist, but that's another conversation for another day. So back to the ACHP. So the ACHP has some on-demand learning courses for Indian tribes and for federal agencies and others undertaking that Section 106 process that you talked about. How have these helped Indian tribes?
The answer to that is really going to depend on the tribe, but I will say that writ large, the availability of these training tools has been really important for people who are new to this sphere. And from the tribal perspective, tribal members, tribal citizens themselves who do this work, they know what needs to be protected. They know what they want to see done in terms of managing an ancestral site or a traditional practice or even a habitat, and that's a conversation for another time. But just what does a tribe consider to be a cultural resource versus what the law might say is a cultural resource? But what a lot of people who are new to this job don't know is the statutes. They don't know the regulations. They don't know what is Section 106, what is the NHPA, what is the ACHP. In many cases, these are folks who they know what to do on the tribal side, but they don't know the law. And so it's been really helpful to have these broad-based, introductory training modules that you can point a tribal practitioner to say, this is what you're trying to manage. These are the laws that you need to know. And in my experience, a lot of tribal folks who get into this work, they're familiar with some of the more politically, what's the word that I want, sort of fancy laws, the ones that get the attention, like NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so what I found is that a lot of newbies think that everything is NAGPRA. It's all NAGPRA. And so that's the law that they'll cite. Well, isn't that a violation of NAGPRA? They have yet to learn, well, actually, no, that's a violation of ARPA, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or it's a violation of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, or. There are lots of different ways that the laws apply, and people don't necessarily know. So the training is very helpful for that. But on another note, and just as important, if not more so, is agency personnel taking these trainings. Because agency personnel oftentimes, well, you said I'm trying to be a diplomat, which is sometimes not easy for me. But there are a lot of agency folks who also don't understand the law. And so if I have something that I can say to a new person from an agency, and what we find oftentimes is that once you're a federal employee, you're kind of going to be a federal employee forever, but people move from one agency to another or from one role to another. And just because they're an employee of that agency doesn't mean they understand the laws and the statutes and the regulations that they need to know for their new role within that agency. So if I can say to a newbie, go to the ACHP, take their training on Section 106, take their training on how to consult with a tribe, learn about what it means to do government to government consultation, which is, it's part of tribal sovereignty. It's incredibly important that agency personnel understand that relationship, and a lot of them don't. So if anything, the most helpful thing for us is training the agency people through the ACHP's modules rather than training the tribes.
Interesting. I think that's a really different perspective. And while you were giving while you're elaborating, it made me think, in this preservation area. I mean, clearly we're talking about someone needs legal training, the various technical skill sets of preservation. I mean, I'm trained as a historian, you're trained as an anthropologist. Do you think there's sort of such a thing as an ideal background, training, degrees for someone who wants to get involved with tribes or preservation?
Well, to some degree, I feel like there's no substitute for experience. But thinking about my own background, and this is a terrible thing to say as somebody who is an academic, but an academic background is not necessarily the best way to prepare for this particular role. And I'll also say that in Indian country, if you enter a room and you say, well, I know everything because I'm a PhD, you've immediately made, if not enemies, a bunch of people who are going to think that you're just arrogant, because the academic knowledge is no substitute for tribal knowledge. All of that being said, if I had to pick, if I could go back in time, an undetermined number of years, and choose a different path for my education, I would have chosen the law. And I'm actually I'm about to end a remote learning program through the University of Oklahoma. I'm enrolled in their Indigenous legal studies program. And so I'll have a Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law by the
Wow,
end of the
congratulations.
year. Thank you. And fortunate that that the tribe was willing to subsidize that program, and also that it was remote, because I'm not going to move to Tulsa. I have a job in San Diego, so I'm staying here. But the things that I've learned in that program, the legal stuff that I've learned, I started using it from the very beginning. And that's really something that's important if you're going to be working in this area. You need to know the whole background of federal Indian policy, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I will say that the bad and the ugly take up much more space than the good. The good has been a little bit more recent, since the 1970s, with more acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty, the development of the THPO program, more advocacy for government to government consultation. But if you really want to do a good job in this position, you need to know federal Indian law. You need to know federal Indian history. You need to know why there are tribes that are located in Oklahoma who are asking to do consultation on projects in Georgia, or why there are tribes in California. And I believe it or not, this is a true thing, true story. I've had a lot of people ask me, what part of the United States are the people of Paula from? And I say, California. Okay, but what I mean is, were they removed from Oklahoma? Were they removed from Colorado? And I say, no, California. We're on Payomkawitchum land. That's where I am right now. And so the people of Paula were moved about 40 miles from their ancestral territory to Paula, but Paula is also a Luiseno tribe, and this is Luiseno territory, Payomkawitchum. And so even that knowledge, people don't realize that tribes are native to California as well as every other part of the United States. So if you don't understand that, you don't have that basic background of Native American history, then that's really, really where you need to start. And I will say that there are plenty of people already doing this job for agencies who need that training. And I would be delighted if the ACHP were able to add modules on federal Indian history and law and policy to their training materials. And I'd be delighted to help with that.
No, I think you've given viewers, listeners, a great deal of practical advice. Because you're exactly right. New PhDs, we're trained to go out and save the world, because of course that's what we're going to do. And so, after I just said all these nice things about your dissertation, we're just going to have to edit that out earlier and focus on.
No, it's good. It's fine, because I'm doing practical work. I will say that academics is wonderful. I love to research and write and read and do all of those things. But there's nothing like the satisfaction of knowing that you have helped to save a site that is irreplaceable. We did that here in Paula. There was a landfill that was going to be put in right next to the reservation, right on the side of a sacred mountain, Chokla, Gregory Canyon, Gregory Mountain in English. And when I came onto this job, the tribe had already been fighting it since I was a teenager. And so, I come on as an employee of the tribe. I knew nothing about it in spite of growing up in San Diego. And it became my responsibility to fight to stop that landfill. And we stopped it. And now the tribe is, we purchased the property, and it's going to be protected forever. There's a bill pending in front of the Senate that our chairman's going to be testifying on, that will put that land into trust, and that way it'll be under the protection of Paula forever. There will be no landfill. And knowing that I helped to do that is so much more meaningful to me than having written a dissertation that now 2 people have read, you and my mom.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what we're doing, what the ACHP is doing, what THPOs are doing, what NAFPO is doing. Let's talk about what we're not doing as we kind of wrap it up. How can the federal government better work with tribes on preserving their sacred and historic properties?
Wow. So I'm going to get a little bit political here, if I haven't been before. But there is a movement among tribal advocates, and it's called Land Back. And I think that Land Back, which basically means return the land to the tribes, is one way that the federal government can be better at helping tribes to preserve their sacred sites, their historic sites, their cultural sites. And I want to point out, and I alluded to it earlier, that a lot of tribal cultural resources are not tangible. They are values, they are feelings, and they are associations. Associations with places, associations with practices. But they are also grounded in the land, the landscape, in what I've learned to call our non-human relatives. And that's not just animals, but that's plants. It's water, it's air, it's land. And so when tribes are able to be, if not managers, at least co-managers of these important places, then they're more likely to be not just saved, because conservation and preservation makes it sound like there's not a human element. We want these lands and these places to be a part of the human experience. And that means that people are on those lands. So if federal agencies can work more directly with tribes and incorporate those tribal values, and that means things like here in California in the West, where we burn all the time, reintroducing tribal cultural burning as a management practice. That's not the same as saying we're going to set aside this sacred site that has, pictographs on it, or a village site with ruins. It's actually returning those tribal traditional values to the land, where you burn something in order to better it. And tribes have so much of that knowledge. And it's the other side of my job. I'm Paula's environmental director too, but those two things are completely intertwined. The land and the culture are one. And I really want federal agencies to recognize that. And the land back movement, I think, is a really solid way to move forward on inviting tribes to become those co-managers. So that's what I would like to see.
I think that's a great way to wrap up. So I think I'd say again, thank you, Shasta Gaughen. Follow the ACHP social media for all of our Native American Heritage Month activities. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.